The datapad was still warm in my hand when I read the words that changed everything. Resolution 7 Omicron, passed without a hearing, passed without a vote among the full membership, passed, as I later confirmed, during a session that was not listed on the official conclave calendar. My name, as humanity's representative, had not been notified. The resolution had simply appeared in the administrative record at 0300 station time, signed by 7 of the 11 council chairs, time-stamped and sealed before any human being on the station had opened their eyes. I had been in this building for 19 years. I had sat in every chamber, attended every session, filed every document in triplicate in the conclave's official script, which I had taught myself in the first 6 months because no translation service was fast enough for the kind of careful reading I needed to do. I knew which corridors echoed in the early morning, and which ones the maintenance team had carpeted into silence. I knew the precise hum of the ventilation system in Chamber 3, and the way the observation panels cast long shadows at the end of the station's artificial afternoon. I had eaten at the diplomatic cafeteria long enough to know which Velhari staff members liked their tea strong, and which Drev representatives were more relaxed after the second hour of any meeting. I had learned this place the way you learn a city you are not allowed to fully enter. From the outside of its doors, from the corners of its rooms, from the one chair at the end of the table that was never pulled up close enough to actually reach the table. And now I was reading a document that told me the 400,000 people living on Eridani V had 90 standard days to leave, not 400,000 visitors. Not a temporary settlement or a survey crew. People who had been born there, many of them, people whose grandparents had broken that ground 60 years ago, who had built schools and hospitals and water treatment facilities, and laid agricultural infrastructure across soil. They had spent a generation learning to coax into productivity. There was a botanical garden in the colony's central district, planted by the third cohort of settlers, now old enough that the trees had real height and real shade. There was a university that had graduated 4,000 students. There were cemeteries with 60 years of graves in them. There were families on that world who had never lived anywhere else, and who had never had a reason to believe they ever would. The colony on Eridani V was not an outpost. It was a home. It had been a home for longer than most of the junior conclave staff members in this building had been alive. And it had been reclassified, overnight, without notification, without hearing, without any mechanism a reasonable person could describe as a process, as an unauthorized developmental incursion into a buffer zone that had not existed when the colony was established. I set the datapad down on my desk. I straightened it so its edges were parallel to the desk's edge. I did this slowly and deliberately, because I had learned, a very long time ago, that the moments when your hands want to shake are exactly the moments when you should do something precise and small and completely controlled. My name is Dara Messon. I have represented humanity in the Galactic Conclave for 19 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I took this post at the age of 37, when my predecessor, a man named Owen Grady, retired after 16 years of the same quiet, grinding, thankless work, and told me over a long dinner that the job would hollow you out if you let it. He said the trick was to decide, very early, what you were holding on to, and then never let that thing get close enough to the conclave to be touched by it. He had held on to his family. He called them every evening regardless of the time difference, regardless of whether he had anything particular to say, just to hear familiar voices in a building that spent most of its energy reminding him that humanity was not quite important enough to fully acknowledge. What I had held on to was the number. Not a sentimental number, not a symbolic one, just the actual, documented, cross-referenced count of things that had been done to humanity since we joined this body under provisional status, 43 years ago. Provisional status. The phrase itself was a small masterpiece of bureaucratic diminishment. It suggested a temporary condition, something in the process of being resolved, a classification that existed only because the full evaluation had not yet been completed. In the conclave's original charter, provisional status was described as a transitional designation, intended to last no more than 10 standard years, while a new member species demonstrated its commitment to the body's principles of mutual respect, non-interference, and cooperative engagement. Humanity had been provisional for 43 years. The 10-year transition had been extended 9 times. Each extension was voted on by the full membership, which meant 11 species were asked. Every 5 years whether humanity had earned the right to be treated as an equal. Every 5 years the answer was no. The reasons given shifted slightly between cycles. The language varied. Different committee reports emphasized different concerns, but they all occupied the same general territory. Humanity's historical record of internal conflict, its emotional volatility in diplomatic settings, its tendency toward what the Velhari representative had once described in an official session as reactive decision-making, which was a sophisticated way of saying that humans sometimes responded to things with visible feeling, and visible feeling was apparently evidence of developmental immaturity in a body where the oldest member species had been refined by 3,000 years of interstellar governance. I had sat through every one of those votes that fell within my tenure. I had sat through 4 of them in this building, at the end of this table, in the chair that was not quite close enough. Each time, I had delivered humanity's formal non-binding objection, which was the only form of objection we were permitted to make under Article 6, Paragraph 3 of the Charter. The objection was entered into the administrative record. It was not debated. It was not answered. It was placed into the file alongside the vote result, where it sat with the other non-binding objections from all the other provisional members who had learned to speak carefully in rooms where their voices carried exactly the weight the room chose to give them. Every objection I had ever filed was still in those records. I had been giving them reasons to look at those records, methodically, every year, building the file that would one day need to be built. 2 colony applications rejected, no reason given. That was not a requirement under Article 6 for provisional members. But it represented, in practical terms, 2 population centers never built, 2 sets of infrastructure never laid, 2 futures that never started. I had those documented under Reference Group 7, cross-referenced against charter language governing buffer zone designations, and the dates when those zones had been drawn relative to the applications they rejected. 14 trade route exclusions within 40 light-years of Sol, citing a navigation buffer that applied exclusively to provisional member species. In practice, human commercial vessels could not legally access several of the most efficient interstellar corridors in the region without applying for special transit permits, which were denied at a rate of approximately 90% over 14 years. Reference Group 12. 8 instances of member species legally refusing diplomatic meetings with human representatives, citing a Type 2 developmental species classification that had appeared in humanity's conclave file in year 7 of our membership without formal proposal, without debate, appended following a routine review by an administrative staff member whose name was in the record, but who had never been asked to explain the basis for the addition. The classification allowed full member species to decline meetings with provisional members in certain circumstances. It was structural, not personal. That was what made it so effective and so persistent. Reference Group 3. The jump gate construction permit rejections numbered 6 over 14 years. Each denial cited procedural restrictions related to provisional member infrastructure development in designated zones. Each zone had been drawn or redrawn within the 2 years preceding the relevant application. Reference Group 9. All of this was in the files. All of it had been endured. All of it had been documented with the patience of someone who understood that the documentation was not just a record of grievances. It was the architecture of a legal argument that had to be built correctly, grounded in specific facts and precise language, or it would not hold when the moment came to use it. Resolution 7 Omicron was the moment the conclave stopped being careful. Every previous action had been threaded through existing procedural mechanisms that gave it the appearance of a valid process. Denying a permit was not the same as openly violating a treaty. Refusing a meeting was not the same as issuing a hostile declaration. Extending provisional status was not the same as expulsion. Everything had been done within lines, which was precisely why responding to it had required such patience. You cannot challenge a process until the process makes a clear and documentable error. Resolution 7 Omicron was that error. Passed without a formal session, without notification to the affected party, without review, without any mechanism for appeal or response. It told 400,000 people they had 90 days to leave a home that had stood for 60 years, in a buffer zone that postdated the colony's founding by decades. It had not even included a contact name for the administrative body that would oversee compliance. It was written the way you write something when you genuinely expect no meaningful response. When you are so certain of the other party's powerlessness that maintaining the appearance of process feels unnecessary, that certainty was the mistake. I read the resolution a second time. Not for content. I had understood the content on the first read. I read it again to confirm what it did not contain. No appeal mechanism. No review period. No contact for compliance. No citation of the specific administrative order that had created the buffer zone. Nothing that acknowledged the 400,000 people it affected as people who might have something to say about their situation. Then I set it down, opened my legal files, and found page 847 of the Galactic Conclave's Foundational Charter, Article 14 Delphi. The Mutual Non-Interference Clause. I had read it so many times over 11 years that I could have recited it from memory. I read it again now anyway, because there is a discipline in returning to the actual text rather than your memory of it, and because this particular reading was the last time I would be reading it for preparation rather than for use. The language was clear. The Mutual Non-Interference Clause applied to all entities in a formal relationship with the conclave body. Not founding members. Not full members. All entities in a formal relationship. Humanity had been in a formal relationship with the conclave for 43 years. The clause had been written before humanity joined. It had never been amended in any of the 37 charter revision cycles since it was drafted. I had known about Article 14 Delphi for 11 years. I had found it in a footnote buried in a report from my predecessor's predecessor, a document filed and archived without much attention, and I had spent 3 months quietly verifying the interpretation before I told anyone about it. Then I had told 3 people, the Secretary General, the head of Earth's Interspecies Legal Division, and a junior ambassador at the Interspecies Commerce Tribunal, named Layla Osei, who had read my analysis in full and said, with the careful precision of someone who means exactly what they say, that if this argument was right, it needed to be made perfectly, or not at all. We had spent 11 years making it perfectly. I opened a secure channel. Admiral Yusuf Haruna appeared on the first screen. He commanded humanity's Second Fleet, and had the particular quality of composure that comes from spending a career in situations where falling apart is not an option. He did not ask what had happened. He had seen the resolution in the overnight feed. Dr. Priya Sachdev appeared on the second screen, director of the Seoul Economic Authority. She had spent 6 years quietly building an inventory of every service that humanity provided informally to a conclave member species. Services not contracted, not formally acknowledged, not reflected in any official record, upon which considerable conclave infrastructure had come to quietly depend. She had a spreadsheet she updated every quarter that she had once described to me, over dinner, as the most important document that no one in this building had ever thought to request. Ambassador Layla Osei appeared on the third screen, now senior representative to the Interspecies Commerce Tribunal, which was technically separate from the conclave, which mattered more than most people understood. She had a cup of tea and her desk was already covered in documents, which meant she had been awake for hours. "Is this the one?" Layla asked. I said yes. None of them spoke for a moment. Then Priya said she would need 48 hours to verify the inventory numbers. I told her she had 72. I closed the channel. I noted the time. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked down the corridor toward the chamber where I had already filed a request for an emergency formal session. The walk was the same as it had always been. The same corridor. The same pale floor. The same ventilation hum. The Velhari administrative staff nodded as I passed. I nodded back. The chamber was half filled. Sutheth was at the head of the long curved table. I walked to the end. My chair. The one without a nameplate. I sat down and folded my hands on top of my documents. Suthith acknowledged my presence with the formal inclination used for provisional member representatives, fractionally shallower than the one used for full members. 7 degrees, approximately. I delivered humanity's formal objection to Resolution 7 Omicron, noting the absence of notification, review period, and appeal mechanism. Sutheth informed me that humanity's provisional status meant it lacked standing to formally contest resolutions in matters of zone designation and resource allocation. Article 6, Paragraph 3. I wrote that down. Every word. The session lasted 11 minutes. I walked back to my office. I sat at my desk. I looked at the Cape Town photograph on the wall. Then I opened my legal files, found page 847, and began the work that would take 72 hours to complete and would change everything that came after. Some things are worth doing right, and this was one of them. The brief took all 72 hours, and then a few more beyond that. And I want to be honest about what those hours were like, because the way this kind of work gets described later rarely resembles what it actually feels like from inside it. It is not dramatic. There are no moments of sudden clarity where the right argument presents itself in a flash of inspiration. It is instead a sustained, careful, methodical construction, the way you would build something structural, not reaching for the next piece until the current one is secured. Always checking that the foundation is bearing the weight you are putting on it, before adding more. 6,000 pages. Every single claim anchored to a specific record, a specific date, a specific named official action, a specific clause in a specific document. Nothing inferred, nothing vague, nothing that asked the tribunal to take our word for something, when we could give them the actual administrative record instead. The argument itself was almost simple when stated plainly. The conclave had violated its own foundational charter, in documented ways, across 43 years, and we could prove each instance of it. Simple to state. Detailed beyond description to prove. Owen Cole kept coffee arriving at my desk at intervals I never had to request. He was 29 years old and had been working with me for 2 years, and I had decided somewhere in the first 6 months that he was going to be exceptional at this work. He had the particular quality that good diplomatic staff develop when they are paying attention to the right things, an awareness of what the moment requires that operates without needing to be asked. During those 72 hours, what the moment required was that every possible source of friction between me and the work be removed. And Owen understood that without my saying so. Priya's service inventory arrived on hour 41. I had asked her to make it specific in the way that legal documents require specificity. Not impressionistic, not rhetorical, just the actual data laid out in the actual sequence it occurred. The DREV Homeworld Atmospheric Modeling Service. 18 years of continuous provision. Quarterly. Never contracted. Never acknowledged in any official conclave record. Provided by a rotating team of 14 human climate scientists on 6-month postings to a station far enough from Seoul that 18 months of continuous deployment was more than anyone should manage alone. The team had developed, over 18 years, baselines for that planetary system's weather behavior that had no equivalent anywhere in the conclave's scientific record because no other team had been studying it for that long. The agricultural predictions they produced had become increasingly precise every year. The baselines matured. The DREV ministry responsible for quarterly planting cycle decisions had structured those decisions around this data for well over a decade. None of this was in any official document. It existed only in the scheduling records of humanity's Scientific Service Corps, in the technical reports delivered to the DREV station, and in 18 years of grateful private messages from DREV agriculture officials who had been told by their own government that thanking the humans officially might complicate the provisional status question, the Orathi Jump Corridor maintenance. 11 years, 23 rotation cycles, a debris accumulation rate that without continuous intervention would have produced documented transit delays within 3 years, and a calculable collision risk within 7. The work was done by human long-range engineering crews on volunteer rotations because the specific combination of deep space endurance, long-duration isolation tolerance, and precision engineering required to run the operation was something that humanity had and that no other species in the conclave's membership currently possessed in the relevant combination. The operation had been running since before I arrived on the posting. My predecessor had known about it. It had been quietly logged in humanity's internal service records and nowhere else. Priya had documented 16 other arrangements of similar character, ranging from the significant, like the orbital debris survey humanity had been running for the Velhari home system for 9 years, to the quieter but essential, like the translation services humanity's linguistic division had been providing gratis to 3 smaller member species who could not afford conclave standard translation equipment, and who would have been effectively shut out of certain technical proceedings without human assistance. 16 arrangements, running in parallel, spanning a combined history of well over a century of human service hours, none of them reflected in any conclave record, none of them acknowledged in any official document, all of them quietly essential to the smooth functioning of a body that had spent 43 years classifying the species, providing them as not yet ready for equal treatment. I incorporated the inventory into Section 4 of the brief, which addressed the asymmetric nature of the relationship that provisional status had enabled and sustained. It was not the strongest legal section in the strict sense of legal argument. The strongest section was the Article 14 Delphi analysis in Section 1, which ran to 840 pages of close textual and historical analysis that Layla's team had been refining for 3 years. But Section 4 carried its own weight. It showed, in specific and measurable terms, what the conclave had been receiving from humanity while simultaneously classifying humanity as not yet ready for equal participation. That disparity was not an argument in isolation. It was context. And context, in any honest reading of a legal situation, matters. Layla's team transmitted the final version of their Section 1 analysis on hour 54. I read it in full before incorporating it, which added 2 hours to the timeline, but reading it in full was necessary. Not because I did not trust the analysis, because I was the one who was going to file it, and I needed to know every sentence of it the way you know something you have written yourself, so that in any subsequent proceeding where I was asked about it, I could speak to it without hesitation. On hour 69, I read the complete brief from page 1. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. I made 9 corrections, none of them to substance, all to language precision in passages where a slightly different word choice would close a possible counter-argument before it could be opened. On hour 71, Owen printed 2 physical copies in the conclave's official script. He brought them to me in a flat case and set them down. I held them for a moment. The weight of 6,000 pages printed on diplomatic-grade material was specific and real. I held it for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I sealed 1 copy in a formal diplomatic envelope and addressed it to Ambassador Layla Osei at the Interspecies Commerce Tribunal, with a cover note that was 2 sentences long. The other copy stayed on my desk. I opened the conclave's administrative system and navigated to the formal withdrawal notification form under Article 9 of the Charter. Article 9 granted every provisional member the unconditional right to withdraw with a minimum of 30 standard days' notice. The form had placeholder text in 3 of its required fields, which told you something about how often it had been used. I filled in all 3 fields carefully, using the exact legal language that Article 9 specified, and reviewed the completed form twice before submitting it. I submitted it at 0900 station time. The date was day 44 following Resolution 7 Omicron, and that date was not arbitrary. I had calculated it. The resolution had specified a 90-day compliance deadline. Filing the withdrawal on day 44 meant it would be logged, processed, and fully entered into the administrative record before the compliance deadline entered its enforcement phase. The sequencing meant that if the conclave later attempted an enforcement action and claimed it was a response to non-compliance, the withdrawal record would predate that action by 46 days. The legal and diplomatic reading of events would be that humanity had made a lawful decision before any enforcement had occurred, not that humanity had fled an enforcement it could not resist. The difference was not semantic. In the record that would be read by the tribunal, and by every external party watching this situation, the difference was the entire story. I transmitted the notification simultaneously to all 11 member species, the Conclave Secretariat, the Interspecies Commerce Tribunal, and 6 external parties, 3 non-member civilizations, and 3 independent trade federations, whose attention I had been cultivating with varying degrees of directness over the preceding 6 years. Not because I expected intervention from them, because I knew that when the tribunal filing became public record, those 6 parties would be among the first external observers to read it, and their independent assessments would shape how the rest of the interstellar community understood the situation before the conclave's communications teams had finished drafting their official response. Then I went to the briefing room, set up my own recording equipment, checked the framing, and stood in front of the camera. 7 minutes and 40 seconds. No notes. I had been constructing this statement, refining it, testing its logic, and its pacing, and its word choices, for 11 years. I knew every sentence of it at a level that went below memory into something more structural. It was not something I was retrieving. It was something I had built. I spoke about provisional status, the year it was first applied to humanity, the year the Charter said it would expire, the 43 years of extensions that followed. I named specific permit rejections by their reference numbers. I named refused diplomatic meetings by the dates they had been declined. I named Resolution 7 Omicron by its full designation, and read its operative clause at a pace that allowed anyone watching to transcribe it accurately. I said that Eridani V had been a human colony for 60 years, that the buffer zone the resolution cited had not existed when the colony was established, and that the colony's 400,000 residents had a legal and historical basis for their presence that predated every administrative designation being used to remove them. I said they would not be vacating. I said, in the plainest language I could find, that humanity's withdrawal was not a protest and not a response to emotion. It was a legal act, executed under the conclave's own charter, by a species that had studied that charter more carefully and more patiently than the people who drafted it had apparently anticipated. I said we hoped to find a framework that served all parties well, that we had always hoped for that. The difference now was that we were no longer willing to wait to be invited to the table where that framework would be designed. I turned off the camera, packed the equipment, carried it back to my office. On my desk, next to the brief, there was fresh coffee. I drank it standing. Then I looked at the Cape Town photograph on the wall, took it down carefully, placed it in my bag, and sat at my desk to begin the next part of the work. Owen appeared in the doorway. The boxes he had been packing were stacked neatly against the wall. He looked at me for a moment and then said, carefully, that he had been reading the brief in the background during the 72 hours, as much as he could manage while keeping the coffee supplied and the communications routed, and that he thought it was the most complete thing he had ever read. I thanked him. I told him to finish packing and get some sleep before the transport tomorrow morning. He nodded and went back to his desk. I heard him moving quietly for another hour before the office went still. I stayed at my desk. The withdrawal notification was in the system. The brief was filed. The statement was recorded and transmitted. The 3 calls I had made on the morning I read Resolution 7 Omicron had produced the architecture of everything that followed, and that architecture was now in motion. There was nothing left to do in this building tonight. I stayed anyway for a while, because there is a specific quality to a place when you know you are leaving it, and I had been in this building for 19 years, and the quality deserved a few quiet minutes. The ventilation hummed its familiar hum. The floors were the same pale composite they had always been. Then I turned off the office light and went to pack my remaining things. The signal that something had genuinely shifted came not from inside the building but from outside it. 2 of the 3 trade federations I had notified sent acknowledgement messages within 6 hours. Both messages were brief and formally worded, but each one came with an attachment, a preliminary legal assessment of Article 14 Delphi, prepared by an independent firm. Neither assessment had been requested. Both had been commissioned on the Federation's own initiative within hours of receiving the withdrawal notification. Both assessments arrived at the same conclusion. The clause was broader than the conclave had been applying it. The argument was credible. The tribunal was the correct venue. I noted both in the correspondence log and did not respond immediately. The fact that they had commissioned independent analyses and sent them to me unprompted was itself the communication. They were watching. They wanted me to know they were watching. And the first independent legal eyes to review Article 14 Delphi had reached the same place that Layla's team had reached after 3 years of detailed analysis. That evening, Heth appeared in my doorway. Heth was a DREV representative whose office was 2 doors down, and who had spent 7 years treating me with the specific quality of courtesy that lives in the space between genuine personal respect and the constraints of institutional role. We had eaten lunch together 11 times. Nothing sensitive in any of those conversations, because both of us understood what our roles allowed, but the lunches had been real, and that was its own kind of information. Heth stood in my doorway and looked at the boxes stacked on my floor. Then Heth said, quietly, that the atmospheric modeling data humanity's team had been providing to the DREV Homeworld Climate Office had been considerably more important to Drev agricultural planning than any official record suggested. I said I was aware of that. Heth looked at me for a moment longer. Then Heth left without saying anything else. I noted the conversation and went back to work. The withdrawal was officially logged in the Conclave's administrative system at 2300 station time. I watched the status field change on my terminal. Then I locked the office, picked up the document case, and walked with Owen to the transport dock. He did not speak until we were seated and the transport had cleared the station's docking arm. Then he said, "Do you think they understood what we just did?" I told him some of them probably did. He was quiet. Then, "What happens now?" I said, "We find out what things are worth to them once they can no longer take them for granted." He turned that over in the way that he does when he is genuinely processing something rather than filing it away for later. Then he nodded. I looked out the observation port. The station receded. The conclave building was visible until the transport's angle changed and the view closed. And then it was gone. And then it was a point of light that I could not distinguish from the stars around it. I turned away from the window. There was work to do. The Orathi jump corridor issue appeared in the transit data on day 65 after the withdrawal, and it appeared the way that most real problems appear. Not with a dramatic alarm, but as a pattern in numbers that someone had to look at closely. Enough to notice. The last human maintenance crew had completed their scheduled rotation on day 63 and departed on schedule. For approximately 2 weeks after that, the corridor's natural debris accumulation rate was slow enough that the gap in maintenance looked, in the shipping transit data, like a routine scheduling interruption. Minor increases in course correction frequencies, slightly elevated transit time variance. Nothing that would flag an automated monitoring alert on the first pass. Then the debris density readings started trending upward, in a way that exceeded normal variance, and the Conclave's Transportation Monitoring Office traced the trend back to its origin point, and someone in that office had to sit down with someone in the Transportation Committee and explain that the operation responsible for preventing this trend had been a human program that was no longer operating because humanity had withdrawn from the conclave on day 44. The Transportation Committee convened an emergency review on day 68. I had established a working office on a neutral transit station by this point. It was a small facility, 3 systems from the conclave complex, on a station that nobody in particular owned, which was exactly why I had chosen it. Layla's legal team was on the same station, which was not a coincidence. I had access to a contact in the conclave's administrative structure who sent summaries of relevant sessions through a channel that was not official and did not need to be. The summary from the Transportation Committee review covered 4 pages. The relevant part was concise. The Velhari had 2 cargo vessels operating on fixed cycle routes through the Orathi corridor. Rerouting those vessels around the maintenance gap would add 11 transit days per cycle and increase operational costs significantly enough that the Velhari transportation director had presented the numbers to the committee with the careful neutrality of someone who is describing an expensive situation while being acutely aware that naming the cause out loud would require a different and more difficult kind of conversation. The committee voted to authorize an exploratory process for identifying alternative maintenance arrangements. Exploratory. That word was doing a great deal of work. Finding another species with the specific combination of deep space endurance, long-duration isolation tolerance, engineering precision, and willingness to run an 11-year volunteer operation in a remote corridor without formal recognition or payment was not a project that could be completed in weeks. It was not a project that could be completed in months. The conclave's transportation director knew this. Every committee member knew this. The exploratory process was a way of beginning to address a problem without yet being willing to fully state what the problem was or where it had to come from. I noted this in my log and continued the tribunal preparation work. The atmospheric modeling gap moved through the political system faster because it had an identifiable constituency who felt its absence in immediate and measurable ways. The Drev homeworld had been experiencing climate instability for 22 years. The instability was not catastrophic in the acute sense, but it was a sustained pressure on agricultural yields that had required increasingly careful management of seasonal planting cycles for over a decade. Humanity's modeling team had been the source of the quarterly predictive data that the Drev Agricultural Ministry used to make those cycle decisions. The data had been arriving consistently, on schedule, in the exact technical format the DREV systems required, with an accuracy rate that had improved every year as humanity's team built longer observational baselines for that particular planetary system's behavior. When the data did not arrive on its expected schedule following the withdrawal, the DREV Agricultural Ministry sent a formal inquiry to the Conclave's Science Coordination Office, asking when service would resume. The Science Coordination Office had no record that the service existed. This was not a filing error. The service had never been formalized through the Conclave's administrative channels, because formalizing it would have required acknowledging that a provisional member species was providing an essential service to a full member civilization, which would have created an uncomfortable contrast with the classification of that species as developmentally immature and not yet ready for equal standing. The informal arrangement had persisted because informality served everyone's institutional convenience except humanity's, and humanity had been doing the work anyway because the need was real and humanity had the capacity to meet it. From the Conclave's administrative perspective, 18 years of essential climate data had been arriving from no documented source, and had now stopped. Someone had to explain what had been happening, which required explaining what had been routinely and deliberately not documented, which required a specific quality of conversation about what the Conclave had been choosing not to see. Layla described the atmosphere in those offices, based on what her contacts reported, as the silence of people realizing that a system they thought they understood had been running on components they had never thought to inventory. That silence was not something I had designed. It was the natural result of becoming aware of a gap that had been papered over for so long that the paper had been mistaken for the wall. The DREV Agricultural Ministry's second inquiry, sent 12 days after the first when no answer to the first had arrived, was addressed directly to humanity's sole economic authority, rather than to the Conclave. The ministry used the contact information from a supply agreement that dated back 15 years, the last formal transaction between the two parties that had gone through official channels. The message was polite and specific. It asked whether humanity's climate modeling team was available to resume data provision on a direct bilateral basis, independent of Conclave administrative structures. Priya's office received that message and forwarded it to me with a single comment: bilateral interest confirmed. On the commercial side, Priya's projections showed compounding effects across multiple sectors. The jump gate construction projects that humanity had been denied permits for would have opened faster transit routes to 3 sectors where non-member civilizations were actively developing trade relationships. Without those routes, the commercial opportunities were being captured by independent operators who were not subject to Conclave transit restrictions. The 5-year compounding projection was significant enough that Priya had added a separate column to display the cumulative total, without making the annual figures look implausible. I read all of this every morning. I want to be clear about what I felt reading it. Vindication would be the wrong word. Satisfaction would also be wrong. What I felt was the specific, sober quality of someone who has been right about a problem for a long time, and who understands that being right about a problem is not the same thing as the problem being resolved. The problem would not be resolved until the tribunal ruled, until a new framework was negotiated, until Eridani V was secured in documentation that would not dissolve the next time a council chair made a decision at 0300 without notification. These reports were not the goal. They were evidence that the process was working. That was useful. But the process had not finished yet. The tribunal's preliminary ruling arrived on day 71. Layla's message at 0600 read, "Favorable preliminary." I read it 3 times. Then I set my coffee cup down very carefully and went back to work. The full preliminary ruling was 12 pages. It stated that humanity's filing presented a credible and substantive claim under Article 14 Delphi of the Galactic Conclave's foundational charter, that full tribunal proceedings were authorized, and that all enforcement actions related to matters covered by the filing, including explicitly Resolution 7 Omicron and the Eridani V Vacate Directive, were suspended for the duration of the proceedings. The Conclave could not move against Eridani V, not legally, not while the tribunal was active. Sutheth convened an emergency session within hours of the ruling's release. My contact in the building sent a summary, 4 hours. The Conclave's legal advisory panel presented a 20-page analysis whose careful language could not fully obscure its conclusion. The claim had merit. The tribunal was treating it as a genuine legal matter, and the conclave's position on its 4 decades of treatment of humanity was now subject to external review, in a forum that the conclave did not pay control and could not pressure. 3 council members asked about humanity's timeline for resuming services. The legal advisory panel chair explained, with what I imagined was considerable patience, that this was not the appropriate question for the current discussion. On day 78, I received a meeting request through informal channels from 3 conclave representatives: Veth Chorus, a Drev; Lena, an Orthari; San, a Velhari, who was not Sutheth, and whose relative independence from the chair's office I was already aware of, from 7 years of watching conclave. Internal dynamics. I accepted the meeting, chose the location and time, and arrived 7 minutes early. They arrived together, sat across from me. Veth Chorus opened by establishing that the meeting was informal and not officially sanctioned by the conclave. I acknowledged this. Veth Chorus outlined the offer: accelerated full membership for humanity, bypassing the provisional tier, contingent on 2 conditions. Humanity withdraws the tribunal filing. Humanity resumes the discontinued services. I wrote down both conditions, word for word. Then I said I would consult with Earth. San leaned forward slightly, the Velhari lean that signals a speaker preparing to be frank. San said the council hoped humanity understood the significance of what was being offered. I said I understood it well. San said, the council was aware that the past several decades had not reflected the conclave at its best. I wrote that down. I said I was grateful for the acknowledgement and would relay the offer in full through official channels. The meeting lasted 34 minutes. I shook hands with all 3 on the way out. Lena managed the gesture with the ease of long practice. San made a reasonable effort. Veth Chorus gripped too firmly, the way people do when they have recently learned a custom and have not yet calibrated the force it requires. I walked back to the working office. Owen looked up when I came in. He had been managing 3 parallel work streams and did not stop working while we talked, which was a quality I had always respected in him. I told him the offer and its conditions. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, quietly but clearly, that agreeing to those conditions would mean that every future legal challenge humanity might ever need to bring would begin with the precedent that humanity had withdrawn a valid filing in exchange for a promise. I said yes, that was exactly right. He went back to his work. Earth's response came in 18 hours. 2 sentences. Humanity does not withdraw legal filings as a precondition for negotiation. We are prepared to discuss a framework once the tribunal ruling is complete. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Layla, filed a copy in reference group 41, and poured a glass of water. Outside the window, the neutral transit station's traffic moved in its quiet and continuous patterns. Ships arriving from places I had never been. Ships departing for places I might not reach. The ordinary motion of a galaxy that was, at this specific moment in history, waiting to see what a species with 43 years of documentation and a 6,000-page legal brief would do next. The answer was, wait for the tribunal to finish its work, without disrupting it, without conceding anything for the comfort of parties who had spent 43 years being comfortable with the previous arrangement. Owen brought coffee. He said he had read Earth's response and thought it was correct. I told him I agreed. He said, with the thoughtful deliberateness he used when he was actually working through something rather than summarizing it, that the interesting thing was how completely the conclave had modeled humanity's behavior around a fixed prediction, that the prediction had been made so long ago and confirmed so many times by humanity's patience that it had stopped functioning as a prediction and started functioning as a fact. They had stopped accounting for the possibility that the prediction could be wrong. I looked at him for a moment. 29 years old. I said that was exactly right, and that it was one of the sharpest observations about the situation I had heard. He nodded and went back to his desk. Outside the window, the stars were steady and present. We had work to do, and we did it. The Interspecies Commerce Tribunal's full ruling was delivered 14 months after the withdrawal, at 0600 station time, on a morning when the artificial lighting cycle in the neutral transit station was still in its early gray phase. The slow climb that the facility's designers had built into the system to approximate the quality of dawn, even in a place that had no natural light. Source within range. I had been awake since 0400. Not from anxiety. 14 months of early mornings had made that hour feel like the natural beginning of a working day. Layla had given me the general direction of the ruling 2 days before, in a brief call that told me the outcome without telling me the specifics. I had not asked for specifics. There is a particular quality of focus that comes from sitting with incomplete information, a readiness that disappears the moment certainty arrives. And I had wanted to hold that readiness through the final days because the work between now and the ruling's release still required it. I read the ruling alone. Owen brought coffee and read something in my posture and left without speaking. I had worked with him for long enough now that this kind of calibration happened naturally and without needing to be requested. I was grateful for that. 312 pages. I did not skim them. Legal documents require a specific reading pace if you want to understand what they actually say, rather than what you are hoping they say. And I had spent 19 years developing that pace, and I used it now. 4 hours and 23 minutes. The tribunal found in humanity's favor on 11 of the 14 contested counts. The 3 counts where the ruling went the other way were the jurisdictional boundary arguments, the ones Layla's team had flagged 18 months earlier, as the genuinely contested terrain, where our position, though coherent, was not the only defensible reading of the relevant charter language. We had included those counts in the filing because completeness mattered. A filing that appeared to select only its strongest arguments would have invited the tribunal to wonder what was being omitted. We had never expected to win all 3. 11 out of 14. The ruling established, formally and permanently, in the interspecies legal record, that the Galactic Conclave had engaged in a systematic pattern of treatment toward humanity that violated Article 14 Delphi of its own foundational guilds. Charter across a documented period of 4 decades, the ruling cited specific resolution numbers, specific permit denial dates, specific refused diplomatic meetings, specific provisional status extension votes, and the exact charter language that each action had contravened. It cited the service inventory from Section 4 not as a legal finding, but as material context for understanding the full nature of the relationship that had existed under provisional status. The ruling did not order damages. The tribunal lacked that authority. It did not sanction individual officials by name. It did not require restructuring of the conclave's membership tier system. The tribunal's mandate was to establish the legal record, not to impose specific remedies. The parties would negotiate those, but establishing the legal record was not a small thing. Every interstellar legal proceeding touching on provisional status, membership tier treatment, or foundational charter interpretation that would occur anywhere in this galaxy, in any conclave proceeding or any independent tribunal, in any case for the next 100 years or longer, would cite this ruling. Legal students at every major academy in 6 civilizations would study the Article 14 Delphi analysis in Section 1 as a foundational case. Junior diplomats preparing for conclave assignments would read the ruling before they read anything else, because their senior colleagues would tell them to. Scholars would write papers about it. Policy committees would reference it when reviewing their own institutional practices. The record would say, permanently and without possibility of administrative revision, that humanity had been treated in ways that violated the conclave's foundational principles for 43 years. That this had been proven in a neutral forum using the conclave's own documents as evidence. That the legal argument had been made by a species the conclave had spent 43 years classifying as not yet ready for full participation. I finished reading and sat for a while without doing anything in particular. The weight I had been carrying was still in the posture of my shoulders and the habits of my attention, the automatic precision I brought to everything, the instinctive alertness for procedural nuance. It had not disappeared, but its nature had changed in the way that a carried weight changes when you reach the destination. Rather than when you simply set the load down, you have arrived somewhere. That is different from simply resting. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had spent 11 years working toward this ruling. I had assumed that when it arrived, there would be something warmer in the moment, something closer to relief or satisfaction, or the particular unwinding that comes after long effort. What I felt instead was a quieter thing, more like the stillness that comes at the end of a long piece of work when you understand that the work was complete and correct. and that there was nothing more to adjust. Owen appeared in the doorway after a while. He did not ask how I was or what the ruling said. He had read Layla's public summary. He told me, in the practical voice he used for practical information, that the Drev Agricultural Ministry had sent a communication to the Seoul Economic Authority, asking whether direct bilateral negotiations on the modeling contract were now appropriate. I said they were. He nodded. Then he said that the Velhari Transportation Office had also sent a message to the neutral logistics contact we had established 3 months earlier, asking about timeline for Orathi corridor maintenance. The message was careful in its language, framed as an inquiry rather than a request, but the direction was clear. I said to tell them that the timeline would be established in the framework negotiations, and that we expected those to begin within 60 days. Owen wrote that down and went back to his desk. I heard him making the first of what would turn into several hundred calls over the following weeks, as the negotiation preparation work began in earnest. The formal negotiation process began 53 days after the ruling. Earth sent a full delegation, not a provisional representative with limited mandate, but a complete team with legal counsel, economic advisors, infrastructure specialists, and a senior ambassador with authority to commit the government to binding agreements without routing every decision back to Earth for approval. I was part of that delegation as an advisory member, which was the correct role. I knew the building and the people and the procedural history better than anyone else on the team. Owen led the daily work. That was also correct. We did not negotiate entry into the conclave's existing membership tier as full members, and I want to explain why. Because from outside the situation it might appear that full membership was the obvious goal, and that we were accepting something lesser. Full membership under the existing structure would have given humanity a voting seat and ended the provisional designation, but it would have left the tier system intact. The tier system was the specific architecture through which the treatment documented in our legal brief had been enabled and sustained for 4 decades. The provisional tier, with its limited standing under Article 6, with its non-binding objection mechanism, with its asymmetric participation rules, was not a temporary condition that full membership would erase. It was a permanent feature of the conclave's governance structure, available to be applied to any new species that joined, governed by the same procedural language that had been applied to humanity for 43 years. Joining as a full member would have made us a participant in a structure that had been used against us, and that remained available to be used against any species the conclave found inconvenient to treat as an equal. We negotiated something different. A co-equal partnership framework, implemented as a series of bilateral agreements between humanity and each individual conclave member civilization, structured outside and parallel to the conclave's internal tier system entirely. Each agreement was specific: what humanity would provide, at what price, under what conditions, with what review cycle, and with what recourse mechanism if either party failed its commitments. The agreements were not charity. They were not the continuation of informal arrangements through goodwill channels with no documentation. They were contracts, negotiated on terms that humanity set, because humanity's position at this table was not the same as any position humanity had occupied at any previous table. The Drev bilateral agreement was the first to reach a full draft, in month 4 of the negotiation. The atmospheric modeling program was the central element, but it was not the only one. Priya's team had identified 3 additional areas where human scientific capacity matched Drev research needs, and all 3 were included in the agreement, at terms that reflected genuine market value, rather than the implied obligation of a species that had not previously been in a position to ask for payment. The Drev lead negotiator, a woman named Asha, who had been working in interstellar diplomatic service for 30 years, and who had the specific quality of directness that comes from spending a career in situations where indirectness wastes everyone's time, said during one of the working sessions that her ministry had been worried, when the withdrawal happened, that the modeling data would never come back, that the relationship was too damaged and the terms too changed. I said the relationship was not damaged. The relationship was being correctly valued for the first time. Asha thought about that. Then she said she thought that was probably the most honest statement she had heard in a negotiating session in 10 years. I said I had been saving it. She laughed. Genuine laughter, not diplomatic laughter. We reached agreement on the Drev terms 3 days later. Eridani V was resolved in month 3. formally and in writing, with documentation that would not be subject to administrative reclassification without the consent of both parties. The buffer zone was redrawn using actual survey data submitted to the tribunal's administrative record as part of the findings. The colony's legal status was established in terms that Layla described as the most airtight colonial recognition language she had seen in 20 years of tribunal work. Celia Marsh sent a message to the human delegation through official channels. 4 sentences. The last one said she had told her team not to pack. I kept that message. I have it still. The jump gate permits were issued in month 6. 4 projects that had been in application delay for a combined total of 31 years. The first 2 construction contracts were awarded within 90 days of permit issuance. A young engineer named Dale Farrow, who had been working on the application file for one of the projects since he was a postgraduate student, and who had been told for 11 years that the permit was under review, sent a message to the delegation asking if it was really finally done. Owen wrote back personally to confirm that yes, it was really done. The Orathi corridor maintenance resumed in month 11. Under contract, with defined terms, with a payment structure that reflected the actual cost of running the operation, plus a margin that the Velhari Transportation Council had. After reviewing the alternative cost projections, described as very reasonable, the Velhari cargo vessels that had been rerouting since day 65 of the withdrawal came back through the Orathi corridor on the first transit cycle after maintenance resumed. The rerouting cost column in the Velhari quarterly report disappeared. The contract payment column appeared in its place at a significantly lower number. I noted this in my log without particular feeling. It was what the numbers had always indicated would happen. Numbers tend to do what they indicate when the conditions for them are created. Month by month, the bilateral agreements accumulated. Each one negotiated carefully, with specialists in the room who knew the relevant technical territory, with legal review at every stage, with clear terms and clear accountability, and clear recourse mechanisms for the first time in 43 years of relationship between humanity and the Galactic Conclave. The framework was not a victory. I want to be clear about that, because the word victory carries implications about triumph and defeat that do not describe what actually happened. The Conclave was not defeated. It was corrected. The correction was documented and formalized and built into legal structures that would persist beyond the current personnel. That was not a victory. That was an outcome. The signing ceremony was held in a neutral conference facility adjacent to the conclave complex, not inside the conclave's main chambers. The location was deliberate. The new framework did not require the conclave's internal spaces to legitimize. It existed alongside the conclave structure, as a parallel architecture, which was the correct spatial relationship to convey. Sutheth attended. The chair had not resigned, and I had not expected a resignation. The institution had decided that continuity was more important than symbolism, which is how most large institutions make that particular decision. I understood it even if I did not find it satisfying. At the signing, Sutheth delivered the conclave's formal statement. It acknowledged the framework, expressed commitment to implementation, and contained, near its end, a sentence that had clearly been written and rewritten many times before arriving at its final form. The Council acknowledges the value of humanity's continued engagement. 11 words. I accepted the statement with formal courtesy because the moment required formal courtesy, and because I understood what it had cost to produce those 11 words, and because the important thing about those 11 words was not what they meant to me, but what they would mean in the archive. Future council chairs reading the transcript of this ceremony would find their predecessor acknowledging, in official language, that humanity's engagement had value. Every subsequent conversation would begin from that different starting point, whether or not anyone in the room explicitly noted the change. After the ceremony, Owen stood next to me while the delegation circulated through the reception. He had handled 3 of the bilateral agreement files independently, and had done so with a quality of judgment that had impressed even the conclave's legal team, who were not people who expressed being impressed often. He looked at the room and said he found it interesting how ordinary it appeared, how much like every other diplomatic reception he had attended. I said that was usually how it looked when something significant had actually changed. The room looks the same. The change is in the documents. A woman named Grace Hollis from the Economic Advisors team brought us each a glass of water and asked what the early days had been like when I first arrived at the posting. I thought about Owen Grady and the dinner and what he had told me about deciding what to hold on to. I said the building had felt, in those early days, like a place that was still determining whether to acknowledge that I was present in it. Grace said she supposed it felt different now. I said yes. Different in the documents, different in the record, different in the way that matters most, which is the way that persists after the specific people involved have moved on. She thought about that, and then went to find the DREV representatives, who needed to discuss the first annual review cycle for the modeling contract. Owen watched her go. Then he said, quietly, that he thought the work we had done was going to matter for a long time. I told him I thought so too. Then I told him that the work going forward would be his, which was as it should be, and that I thought he was ready for it. He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded, once, and went back to work. That was the right response. It was exactly what I would have hoped for. I retired 6 months after the signing ceremony. The decision had been forming for longer than that, accumulating the way decisions accumulate when they are real, rather than reactive, building weight slowly over months until the moment arrives when you simply know that the weight has finished building and the decision has been made. The thing that made the retirement correct was not tiredness, though there was tiredness. 19 years in a specific role creates a specific kind of depletion that is not dramatic and not crisis, but simply the particular exhaustion of guys, having poured yourself into one form for so long that the form starts to constrain rather than shape. What made it correct was Owen. Owen Cole was ready. He had been ready, in the specific sense that matters, for approximately 8 months before the signing ceremony, and I had known it in the same way I had known in his 6th month that he would be exceptional at this work. The knowledge arrived not through a single observation, but through accumulation. Every decision he had made in the preceding months, in the negotiation sessions and the bilateral agreement work, and the 100 small calibrations that diplomatic service requires every day, had been the right decision. Not perfectly executed in every case, no one's decisions are, but right in their direction, and sound in their foundation, and made with the kind of judgment that cannot be taught directly, but can only be developed through contact with the actual work. My presence in the delegation, at this point, was not helping Owen develop. It was providing a resource that Owen did not actually need, and that was, in the subtle ways these things operate, creating a second authority, in a space that needed one authority to develop properly. The role required one voice. That voice should be his. I also understood something about what the framework needed going forward that I could not better provide, and Owen could. The partnership framework was built on new terms, on a different relationship between humanity and the conclave, and navigating that new relationship required people who had not spent 19 years learning to work within the old one. I had internalized certain habits of careful deference, certain patterns of reading a room that had been calibrated to a set of power relationships that no longer held in the same way. Those habits had been necessary. They were less necessary now, and in some situations they might actively get in the way. What the new framework needed was someone who had absorbed the lessons of the old situation without having been shaped by it in the same way I had been. Owen was that person. The generation he would mentor would be even further from the specific experience of operating under the old constraints, which was exactly right. I made the decision formally on a morning in month 5 after the signing, while reviewing the second quarter progress report on the bilateral agreement implementation. I noted the decision in my personal log and did not tell anyone for 3 weeks, because there was still work to complete, and the decision being made did not change what the work required. I told Owen on a Tuesday afternoon in the 6th month, in the office, with no ceremony, because ceremony would have been wrong for what was actually a straightforward professional transition, rather than a dramatic moment. He said he understood. He asked if I would be available for consultation. I said I would, for a period of 6 months after departure, and that after that he should treat the previous arrangement as fully concluded and proceed on his own authority. He nodded. He wrote something in his notebook, which he had always done when he was recording something he intended to remember. Then we went back to work for the remaining weeks. My last day was a Tuesday. I had not chosen Tuesday deliberately. It was simply when the remaining handover items were completed. I had always believed that the right time to leave a thing is when the work is done, and not when the date feels significant, and the work was done on a Tuesday. I recorded my final entry in the official log that morning, alone in the office, before Owen arrived. I was careful about what I said, and how I said it, because I had understood from the beginning of my posting that the archive was itself a form of work, that what you left in the record was part of what the record would become, and that I owed the people who would read this log a clear account of how I understood what had happened and why. I said that humanity's patience over those 43 years was not weakness. I said it clearly and without qualification, because this was the thing most likely to be misunderstood by people looking back at the history, and I wanted the record to be clear on this point before it became someone else's interpretation. Patience of that kind, I said, the kind that is deliberate, documented, and sustained over decades without losing its direction, is a form of accumulation. Every year of quiet record-keeping, every extension of endurance past the point where a different response might have felt justified, was not resignation. It was material. It was the raw material for a brief that had to be grounded in documented fact, or it would not hold under fact examination. It was the foundation for a filing that had to be made at the right moment, or it would not produce the outcome that the situation required. It was the architecture of a decision that had to be made on our own terms, at a time we chose rather than in response to a provocation we had not anticipated. I said that we had not broken when the council pushed. We had chosen to act when we determined, by our own assessment, that the moment was right and the preparation was complete. That distinction was not semantic. A response to provocation produces whatever outcome the provocation creates, because provocation shapes the terms of the response. A decision made from preparation produces the outcome that the preparation was designed to achieve, because the terms of the response are set by the person responding, and not by the thing they are responding to. I said that the distinction mattered. I closed the log. The desk was clear. The walls were blank. The Cape Town photograph was already in my bag, where it had been since the morning of the withdrawal. 19 years of occupying a wall in that building, and now traveling home with me. I walked through the outer office. Owen was at his desk, working, because he was always working, which was one of the things that would serve him well, and one of the things that would occasionally need to be balanced against other considerations, and he would figure that out, the way everyone who is good at difficult work eventually figures it out. He looked up when I passed. He said, simply, "Thank you, Ambassador." I told him to take good notes. Then I walked down the corridor, through the main entrance, and into the transport bay. The transport was going to Cape Town first, and then to a place near the ocean on the Western Cape that I had thought about, periodically, for 19 years without letting myself think about it in detail, because thinking about it in detail would have made the building harder to return. I had not told many people where I was going. Priya knew. She had sent a message the previous week that contained 2 lines, one saying she thought the outcome of the past 3 years was the most significant diplomatic achievement she had been part of in her career, and one saying she hoped I enjoyed the ocean. Layla had sent a message with a single sentence, "Well done, and rest." Yusuf had sent nothing, which was entirely in character, and which I found more comforting than most messages I received, because it meant that to him this was a professional transition that required acknowledgement but not ceremony, and he had acknowledged it with silence, in the way that people acknowledge things when they know the other person will understand the silence. Correctly, Grace Hollis sent a message on the morning of my departure that surprised me. She wrote 4 paragraphs about what she had learned working on the negotiation team and how she understood the framework differently having been inside its construction than she had from the outside. And at the end, she wrote that she had thought about what I had said at the signing reception, about how change shows up in documents rather than in rooms, and that she had been thinking about it for weeks, and found it the most clarifying thing she had heard about diplomatic work. I wrote back a short reply thanking her, and telling her she should keep thinking that way. Then I got in the transport. The ocean, when I reached it 2 days later, was exactly what the ocean always is. Large and cold and present in a way that very few things are, possessing a quality of indifference to human concerns, that is not hostile but simply factual, the way very large and very old things tend to be. The horizon was clear. The air had the particular character of coastal air that is different from any other kind, and that I had missed in 19 years of recycled station. Atmosphere. Not dramatically, but in the way you miss things that are so fundamental that their absence registers below the level of conscious thought. I sat on a rock above the waterline for a long time on the first morning, not thinking about anything in particular, not reviewing the events of the preceding years or calculating what should happen next or noting observations in a log. Just sitting, just breathing the coastal air, just watching the water move. There is a specific skill involved in this kind of not doing, and it is harder to develop than most people think, particularly for people who have spent many years in positions that required a constant orientation toward the next thing. The body and the mind do not simply stop because the work has stopped. They continue in the patterns they have been running for a long time, looking for the next item in the queue, scanning for the development that requires response, checking the time. I sat on that rock until the scanning stopped. It took most of the morning. Then I walked back to the small house I had rented for the month, and made tea, and sat in a chair by the window, and looked at the garden, which needed attention, and thought that I would give it attention in the afternoon, and that there was no particular reason why this specific afternoon was the right time, rather than tomorrow afternoon or the day after, and that choosing one afternoon was as good as choosing another. This thought was extraordinarily simple, and it took me almost the full first week on the coast before I could hold it without the part of my mind that had been calibrated for consequence, and sequencing immediately finding a reason why it mattered which afternoon. Eventually I chose an afternoon and worked in the garden. Eventually I stopped checking my messages every hour. Eventually I slept past 0400. None of these things happened quickly, because 19 years of specific habits do not dissolve quickly, and I was not particularly trying to make them dissolve quickly. I was simply living in a place that did not require those habits, and allowing them to settle into whatever shape they would settle into when they were no longer needed in the form they had taken. Owen's first quarterly report reached me in month 2 of my time on the coast. He had structured it differently than I had structured mine, with a different emphasis on different elements, which was correct. He should structure reports the way he structured reports, not the way I had. The substance of the report was excellent. The bilateral agreements were tracking well. The DREV modeling contract had completed its first review cycle with both parties satisfied. The Orathi corridor maintenance was running on schedule. The first jump gate construction project had broken ground in the relevant sector. The Eridani v. Colonial Administration had filed its first formal report under the new framework's documentation requirements, and Celia Marsh was listed as a co-author. I read the report once, made no notes, and sent Owen a 2-line reply saying the report was well done, and that the Eridani v. documentation was a good detail to have tracked. He wrote back 3 words. "Thank you, Ambassador." I had told him before I left that he should call me Dara, since the title no longer applied. He had nodded and said he would try. He was clearly still trying. In month 3, I received a message from a legal academy, on a neutral station in the outer conclave territories, asking if I would consider contributing to a casebook they were preparing on Article 14 Delphi and its implications for provisional membership. Jurisprudence. The casebook was intended as a teaching resource for students studying interstellar diplomatic law. I agreed to write a chapter. I wrote it over 3 weeks, in the mornings before the garden, and it was the most deliberate writing I had done since the brief itself. Not because the material was unfamiliar, because a document intended for students needed to be honest in a specific way that legal filings do not need to be honest. Legal filings make arguments. A teaching document has to explain what arguments are, and why they work, and what the cost of making them is. I wrote about patience in the chapter, not as a virtue, because framing it as a virtue suggests it is something intrinsic rather than something chosen and maintained. I wrote about it as a methodology, a set of practices, sustained over time, that allow the slow accumulation of material that can later be used in ways that impulsive responses cannot. I wrote about the difference between waiting because you have no choice and waiting because you have determined that the time is not yet right, and how the only way to know the difference from the inside is whether you are still building the thing you intend to deploy when the time is right, or whether you have stopped building and are simply waiting. I wrote about documentation, about the specific discipline of recording things not as you wish they were but as they are, precisely and without embellishment, because the record has to be able to stand on its own without your interpretation when the moment comes to use it, about the patience required to maintain that precision over years and decades, when the emotional weight of what you are recording makes imprecision feel like relief. I wrote about the tribunal ruling and what it had established, not its legal specifics, which were in the ruling itself and in Layla's published analysis, and in the casebook's other chapters, but what it had meant to have a neutral body read those 43 years of documented actions and state clearly, in the language of law, rather than the language of politics or sentiment, what had happened and what it meant. That kind of clarity, I wrote, is what documentation is for. Not to express feeling, though feeling is present in all of it, but to create a record that can be examined by parties who were not present and who must reach their own conclusions from the evidence. When you document correctly, your conclusions do not need to be stated. The documents themselves state them. The job of the documentation is to make the conclusion inescapable through the weight of specific, accurate, irrefutable fact. The chapter was 23 pages. I sent it to the Legal Academy and they responded within a week, saying it was the piece they had most hoped to include in the casebook, and that they would use it as the opening chapter. I was glad of that. The opening chapter is where students first learn how to read what follows. Starting from a clear account of what patience and documentation actually require, seemed like a useful thing for people entering this field to have. From the beginning. In month 5, Priya called to say that the second round of bilateral negotiations was underway, this time with the 2 member civilizations that had been most resistant in the first round. She said Owen was handling them well and that the framework from the first round was providing useful precedent. She said the conclave's internal conversation about its provisional tier system had shifted in ways that were showing up in the language used in recent administrative documents, and that Layla thought the shift was significant enough to warrant a separate tribunal watch report. I said that sounded right. Priya said she missed working with me, in the straightforward way that Priya said everything, without hedging. I told her the feeling was mutual and that she should call again after the second round concluded. She said she would. In month 6, I sat down at the desk in the small house and wrote the last personal log entry I intended to write in my professional capacity, not for the archive this time, for myself, because there is a kind of completion that requires its own record, separate from the official one, and I had spent enough years maintaining official records that I knew the difference between what they captured and what they could not. I wrote about what it had felt like to make the call on the morning of Resolution 7 Omicron. Not the decision itself. The decision had been made in pieces over 11 years, but the specific moment of making the call, connecting the 3 screens, seeing Yusuf's composure and Priya's alertness and Layla's tea and the documents already spread across her desk. The specific quality of that moment when what had been preparation became action. I wrote about the 11 minutes in the chamber with Sutheth, and how I had written down Article 6, Paragraph 3, and how writing it down had felt like setting the last piece of a structure that had been under construction for 2 decades. I wrote about the transport leaving the station, and the way the conclave building had been visible until the angle closed and then had been simply a point of light among the other points of light. I wrote about reading the tribunal ruling in the rented office, while Owen kept his distance, and the light outside the window did its slow morning climb. And I wrote about what I had said in the official log on my last day, about patience being accumulation, and about the distinction between acting from preparation and acting from provocation. I wrote it again because writing it the second time was different from writing it the first time. The first time I had been writing for the archive. This time I was writing for myself, to understand whether I still believed it the same way. Now that it was no longer a principle I was defending but simply a thing I had done, I still believed it. It was not a principle I had arrived at through reasoning. It was a conclusion I had reached through experience. And experience is harder to argue with than reasoning, because it simply is what it is. What it was, in the end, was this: 43 years of endurance and documentation, and careful preparation, had produced something that 43 years of resistance and confrontation would not have produced. Not because resistance and confrontation are inherently wrong, but because the specific situation we were in required a specific kind of argument made in a specific kind of forum, and that argument could only be made after the preparation was complete. And the preparation required time. We had used the time correctly. I closed the personal log. I set it in the drawer of the desk where personal documents go, the ones that are not official and are not for anyone else. Then I put on my coat and walked down to the water. The ocean was doing what oceans do, which is move without agenda and without reference to anything happening on its shore. The water was cold and clear, and the horizon was steady, and the particular quality of the light at that hour made the surface of the water look like water, something you could read if you knew the language, which of course you cannot, which is part of what makes the ocean worth spending time near. I stood there for a while. I was not waiting for anything. I was not preparing for anything. I was not documenting anything or reviewing anything or checking what came next. I was just standing at the edge of the water in the country where I had grown up, which was also the country I had spent 19 years representing in a building that had spent 19 years trying to decide whether to acknowledge my presence. It had made its decision. We had made ours. The water moved. The light changed in the slow way that light changes when no one is watching the clock. I stayed for a long time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly right.